This is a Relay project.
It's your weekly fill of news and politics. Party All the Time starts now. Here's Vicky Mochama.
I think that serendipity is the most beautiful word in the English language. Even what it means, which is the fact of finding interesting or valuable things by chance, is quite a beautiful idea. And there are plenty of other words competing to be the most beautiful word out there. There's words like aurora and gregarious and plethora. But for one man, and I am certain you know who I am talking about, the most beautiful word in the English language is tariff. It is music to his ears. And yet, Donald Trump's love for the word tariff and his execution of it has sounded like nails on a chalkboard to many Canadians. I am your host, Vicky Mochama, and this week I'm going to be asking some questions about Canada's foreign policy, especially towards the United States. Like, what on earth? And who is that man? Like, really, who is that man with the red tie? And is tariff just a fancy word for tax? And with a major federal election with some big issues, many political parties, and one big decision for everyone to vote for to make, I need some smart people to help me understand. Welcome to Party All the Time. This week, I am joined by Dylan Robertson, the international affairs reporter for the Canadian Press, who is based on Parliament Hill. I'm also joined by Doug Saunders, the international affairs columnist for the Globe and Mail, and Erica Barudis, department head of applied politics and public affairs at Macquarie College, and co-host of the Discourse Pod. Let me toss it out to my guests here. Before we get into the heavy, what is the most beautiful word in the world to you?
Democracy?
Ooh. Why? Understanding. Doug, do you have one?
I'm going to be flaky and say community, but I actually think so. We're all being pretty fundamental and apple pie here. So
we're very safe in our answers, I think.
It's true as well.
I like it. No one's saying autocracy, even though it sounds kind of pretty. This is the Brain Trust. Tariffs, foreign policy, Canada-U.S. relations are a big topic, so let's just dive in. Our regional land-adjacent bestie is not the ally we once had. The reason is by now pretty obvious. American President Donald Trump is not only reshaping his country's domestic policies, but also the relationships that the United States has with every nation on the globe. Here at home in Canada, according to the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, St. John, New Brunswick, Calgary, Alberta, which are energy exporters, and steel towns like Hamilton, Ontario, and forestry producers like Trois-Rivières, Quebec, are especially and particularly vulnerable to tariff threats. So it's coast to coast. So for Canadians, it's a pretty deeply concerning realignment. It is a sea change for some, and for others, it is very much an existential crisis. Domestic concerns like housing affordability, which we did talk about on episode 2 of this show, and healthcare are competing with foreign policy. Especially when it comes to how we deal with the United States, it is a major concern that Canadians have. Dylan, this is your world looking at foreign affairs, and I'm a model United Nations old head from way back when, and I've always had an interest in foreign policy, but I've never seen, at least not to my recollection, this kind of attention paid to foreign policy issues during an election. Tariffs have dominated the headlines, but how big of an issue is it for the voting public?
It seems to be the top issue for the first time in many, many elections that foreign policy is ranking as the top issue for Canadians. And it's a strange one because it's actually resonating across the country. There isn't a region in Canada where tariffs doesn't rank the highest when you look at the polling, when you look at the demographic snapshots. When we ask people what is the top topic and are we talking too much about it, especially in the Angus Reid polling, it's surprising. People say, no, this is just enough. That's about half. And then a third or so say we actually need to talk about it more. And so it's been really a challenge for some of the party leaders to change the channel on that, to talk about healthcare. The most obvious example of that is Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, who has been doing a series of announcements pretty much every morning, a fair amount of meaty topics, and by 1 p.m. it's totally discounted because something is coming out of the White House, or Liberal leader Mark Carney is talking about our approach to the U.S. It's sort of been all-encompassing. It's been largely to the benefit of the Liberals being able to have Mark Carney look prime ministerial and talk about the relationship with the U.S. being broken. It's also sort of had a huge challenge for the NDP and the Bloc and the Greens to look at anything else. Even in Quebec, sovereignty questions, the sort of bread and butter. It seemed in the polling that we'd been heading towards a possible referendum in Quebec in a few years, and that's sort of taken the rug completely out from under it.
We're recording about 2 days after the French language and English language debates, where this very issue, Canada-U.S. relationship, in some way was a major topic of discussion. But, as you've mentioned, the Conservatives are trying to establish a very prominent domestic economic agenda and are being kind of pulled aside by what America is doing, whereas the Liberals have made it a central pitch of their campaign is that they're the party that can tackle Donald Trump. What have they said about how they will actually approach the Trump issue? How will they approach this White House?
Yeah, so their approach is actually quite similar to the other party leaders. A lot of it is about having people's backs. Not necessarily that it would look like the COVID supports, but saying that we would have economic supports for Canadians, that we want a functioning relationship with the US, and sort of talking about that eventual negotiation, which is a way to sort of, placate what Trump is asking for, while at the same time saying the relationship as it stood is over. And it's a way to sort of project strength, competence at a time when people are really concerned about their jobs. One of the things that me and my colleagues have been corrected on when we go on the campaign trail and we talk to people at these rallies, we say, are you worried about the eventual impact? And they look at you and say, the impact is happening. The investment is drying up. We have people pausing their jobs in Windsor. Everyone in Hamilton talked about Windsor constantly. They felt, we're just down the highway and that this is coming at us like a speeding train. And so I think, it's a way to kind of look at how do we talk about relationships with other countries as a sort of medium and long-term thing, saying we'll have your back in the short term and just making people feel a bit more on solid ground. And it's not really so different from what the Conservatives have been saying. The tone is a little bit different. There's also questions about the Conservative base and not trying to alienate those folks. But for the most part, the leaders, especially the Liberals, have been capitalizing off of saying, we'll be there for you. And in the long term, we're looking to partners elsewhere.
Erica, I'd love to bring you in on that discussion. It doesn't seem from the outside, like at the leaders' debate, Pierre Poilievre said he'd mostly do the same things that the Liberals have done, but underlined that his strategy is one of strengthening Canada's economy, from tax cuts to shifts in how we build and manage major projects. It doesn't necessarily seem like there's a huge amount of daylight between the two frontrunner parties in the Liberals and the Conservatives. If for Canadians this is about picking, the one CEO to take on a hostile CEO, what are their differences? Are there any? Do you see any?
Well, I think the biggest criticism for Pierre versus, say, Mark Carney in this situation is if you're going off sole resume, I think the argument can be made that maybe Mark Carney has been at more of these tables. Now, at the same time, I think that this did start off as the ballot box question, to Dylan's point. I think as the campaign has progressed, what we've saw is the rise of economy and cost of living is still top of mind to Canadians. And I think that is actually because of what Dylan said, the impacts of the tariffs already taking effect and people worrying about that. So I do think that Mark Carney, as Prime Minister, and maybe as his resume shows, would be ideally the better candidate. Now, because they have the same plan and the economy issue is creeping up, the Conservatives, both in the polls and I think in messaging, have been able to close that gap. And so again, where we are now versus when this airs, I suspect that a lot of the numbers that we see today, on April 18th, will be closer coming out of after advanced polls, and kind of that undecided vote is pretty small right now. And so I do think that we're going to see people looking past tariffs, which is a good thing for democracy because, again, voters look at what are the issues du jour, which was tariffs, but now that they're actually farther along, can look at who do they want to be leader for 4 years, not this 4-month potential issue. So it's hard to tell what they would do differently. I mean, Mark Carney has also come out maybe more conservative than what we've seen from this Liberal Party in the last 9 years. So I think it's hard for the average person to dismantle sometimes which of the two front runners are saying what. But from the debates and everything, I think where they do differ is, okay, we've learned from this, unfortunately, that we have not been a good trade partner of our own within Canada. And so how are they going to make sure that we can't control Trump? All of them said that. We can't control this variable. What we can control is how we act as a country. All leaders are saying we need to do more interprovincially, but I think the difference is when it comes to natural resources, where Pierre can really actually be different than all the three other leaders.
Yeah, that is one of the things that has struck me over the last couple of weeks. It doesn't feel like weeks, it feels like years, but that is the Trump effect on time. It does feel like, it has brought together a Team Canada approach. There's still some fractures within that particular approach, but its impact on the federal race has been that we're still deciding who's going to lead Team Canada. And so neither person has positioned themselves as the guy for Team Canada. In the meantime, provincial premiers like Daniel Smith and Doug Ford have each sort of taken on their approach or their idea of how to best settle this issue, right? And so in the absence of, the leader, and neither of them saying too many hugely different things, we're kind of in a middle ground, stuck between a rock and a hard place, as it were.
Yeah, I definitely think that we're seeing that is like how people are maybe paying more attention than they have in the past because you have to get into the devils or in the details here. And so I do think, I'm involved in politics every single day. It's what I do and what I've done for the past 2 decades. But for, my friends that I run with, this has been more of a topic of discussion, I think, than ever before. 1, because of international threats, and 2, because I think, it was kind of a runaway for the Conservatives until a couple weeks ago. So I do think Canadians are paying more attention. I do think most from the outset have decided this is the lowest undecided rate we've seen in history, in the 6 to 7% of undecided. So I think we can kind of anticipate how close this race is going to be.
Doug, I want to bring you in because you've focused on international affairs and Canada's role and on the global stage. How does this moment sit with you as somebody who's been observing Canadian foreign policy evolve and shift over your time?
Well, you could say the first Trump term in 2016 was a slap in the face to the Liberal government in Canada, in that it taught them that most of the foreign policy agenda that they had promised in the election the previous year could not be accomplished with the United States not in the game. All of the things with China and the Americas and trade and the environment were much harder to do and often impossible to do without the United States as a partner. And there were attempts to find new ways to do things by working around the United States, but that was awkward. This time around, it's taught both the liberals and the conservatives that you have to talk about a foreign policy that not only works around the United States but is opposed to the United States. So the first term was learning you can't do what you'd wanted to do. This one is learning that you have to do some completely different stuff than you'd ever done before, and it's caused a realignment in both parties. Really, traditionally in Canada, the Liberal Party has been the more pro-American party. It's been in favor of free trade and open borders, with the notable exception of the 1980s. Liberals have had to learn to be anti-American. Conservatives have had to learn to speak anti-American. And that's true about conservative parties around the world. I mean, it was quite something to hear Friedrich Merz, the newly elected Chancellor of Germany, who's one of the most pro-American politicians they've ever had, who worships Ronald Reagan and so on, to the day of the election in that country start talking about American imperialism being a threat to our country that we have to fight, and sounding like the guy selling socialist worker outside the subway station or something like that. And those sorts of transformations have been forced almost overnight on parties of the left and the right. I would argue that it's a little bit harder on conservative parties in many countries.
Yeah, you speaking on that, you've written for The Globe this week about the kind of impact Trump's language around culture wars is having on politics elsewhere. Can you tell us a bit about what has happened in Australian politics in the wake of Trump?
Well, it's like it's like the upside down world, where on the other side of the earth there is an almost identical political situation happening, where you had an opposition leader from a conservative party, which in Australia are called the Liberals, just to keep us confused, who had gone in quite aggressively on a culture war agenda that he explicitly said was modeled after Trumpism. He went on about ridding the public service of the woke mind virus and getting rid of gender politics and ending DEI institutions and these sort of things. And from the day of Trump's inauguration, suddenly went from having a huge lead in the polls that made his party seem certain to win a majority to plummeting to a double-digit deficit. That doesn't necessarily mean his party will lose the election, but it will make it much, much harder. And in response, he has dropped most of the anti-woke stuff, most of the culture war stuff, and gone for more substantial, traditionally conservative policies of lower taxes, more open economy, and that sort of thing. Is it too late? We don't know. We'll have to see. Very similar to the Canadian situation. And I think we've talked about how the Trump situation has forced parties to be more anti-American. But the other thing it's done is it's discredited a whole category of conservative politics, or at least of conservative memes and messaging. The whole culture war, anti-woke stuff had a good-sized constituency, and not just of conservatives and not just of middle-aged white guys, but a lot of people who didn't like the language of culture of DEI policies or of woke stuff. Maybe liked the idea of a leader who didn't talk that way, or who challenged some of that stuff. But when they started seeing somebody in the United States actually take those ideas literally and, ban all government documents containing the word equity, even in like banking departments and things like that, and throwing people out of the country based on their appearance, and insisting that libraries not carry books by black novelists, but do carry Mein Kampf, and so on. That has caused a lot of voters, I think, to back off and to say, okay, I didn't really mean that literally. We don't actually want that here. And I think it's kind of ended that type of politics as something because it's now associated with what's happened in the United States. And it seems like you're parroting Trump. So I think we're watching in Canada. Australians are watching there. Germans are watching there. The parties of the right back away from the culture war stuff that seemed like such a sure winner a year ago and now really repels voters.
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm struck by is that, as we saw at the leaders' debate and we've seen over the last couple days and weeks of the election, is that it hasn't been about, there's been the odd flare-up like Buttongate, but there hasn't been kind of broad-based, there's usually the kind of spate of like, we discovered this person said X homophobic, racist thing online. It has been much more focused on substantive policy, which I found a breath of fresh air. But I've also found interesting to hear from both parties that they aren't interested in fighting out the culture wars. It's this interesting ricochet of American politics into Canadian politics. It's like the mirror image of what of Americans have had to deal with, and we're getting a different version. Do we think it's because the issues are just that serious, that they have that much more gravity?
Both parties have had to drop a number of candidates. I don't know if it's a record number or anything like that, but there have been over various offenses and things they've said or governments they've been supportive or associated with and so on that I think in previous elections, Dylan would know better than me, in previous elections would have been much bigger stories that might have hurt the parties and have kind of slipped on the radar. Everybody's been saying, oh, the Liberals have lost another guy for being supported by Beijing, or the Tories have lost somebody else for saying something absolutely unspeakable. It just seems to have been sort of a page 7 issue,
Yeah, it's been a weird shape of the election as well, because this was technically a snap election, but we all sort of saw it coming. And yet the nominations sort of came way at the last minute. There's been a lot of turbulence within the Conservative war room that's been pretty publicly aired. It is a bit odd, though. There's a few things that have been said that normally would be unacceptable, and there's so much more permission to slow walk it. And normally, the day that you have to lock in your candidates, you see a huge dump of, opposition files, and we had staffed up for that, and it was kind of a nothing burger. It just became another thing about, Trump tariffing penguins or another sort of distraction from Washington.
Yeah, I definitely feel like I've lived in a few war rooms where I've actually run an oppo and issues, and this is like, everyone's Teflon this election, that nothing is sticking to anyone. And even in the debates, you see a lot of the Brookfield questions, the releasing of investments. And unfortunately for, I think, the other parties against the Liberals, it's not sticking. And I think it is because people just care about owning a home and what these tariffs mean for them, and just that cost of living that they've struggled with. When you look at it for the first time, even like healthcare is not as high on the ballot questions and education as we've seen. And even though that's not a federal jurisdiction per se, but even the questions asked, a lot of the candidates on these debates are answering pretty middle, pretty similar. And so I think that people are looking for the differentiator. They're looking for who's going to lead. And so we're asking more questions about the leader of the party. But I can just tell you, like, you do a lot of oppo research, and a lot of it is just kind of falling on deaf ears, because I think that there's just such a loud focus on the economy and our international relations. And not even to the extent of, like, Doug's talking about a lot of our partners, Commonwealth partners. The Prime Minister went over to Europe in his first mission. And that's, saying we're looking for other partners. That doesn't even get it's not resonating or getting recognition either. So I think everyone's really struggling to break through the noise and trying to throw the grenades that you see. This is a very boring election. I think the only jazziness was Blanchette during the debates, like throw in some grenades, knowing that he didn't have to focus on anywhere else but Quebec. And he could take those jabs at the Liberals that he knew what he needed to do in that debate. But otherwise, this has been a pretty boring 30 some days.
It's not.
If I could just,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, if I could just add the issue set as well. If you go to the third-party advertisers list, there's lots of solid issues there. There's housing, there's the Middle East, Israel, Gaza, lots of things that we're really not talking about. And it's quite shocking when you think about how much energy it actually takes to become a third party, how much money you're trying to put on the line. And there's just no interest in hearing any of it among the electorate.
I was going to say, it's not that boring an election or a debate if you follow Yves-François Blanchette and drink every single time he pivots an answer to Quebec. It's a good game. It's a lot of fun. Or when he makes
me laugh. He was making me laugh in both debates. Like, I was just like, this guy gets what his role in this debate is. And he knows he's, like he said, he's like, I'm not going to be the prime minister. I am here for one reason, and it's to basically hold you guys accountable.
Yeah, I thought that was great.
Although his party is being trounced in the only province he cares about.
I know. And that's what I think why he came so hard on the Liberals. Like, I thought it was interesting on how Singh came about it, because I was like, who do you see as your opponent? It was clear that Blanchette sees the Liberals as his threat.
This is All Due Disrespect, the portion of the show where our guests shake it off and let us know who has earned their admiration or is benefiting from their contempt this week. We do it with a lot of grace, of course, and you can swear, but the rule, as ever, and it's the only one, is to not get me sued. I'm going to kick us off this week with a deep, heartfelt shout out. We've been talking about them a lot. We might as well give them some respect to good old American ingenuity. Because eggs are $7 million a carton, American TikTokers are suggesting that people, instead of dyeing eggs, dye potatoes and marshmallows for Easter. Now, Easter is last week for us, but right now it's just days away. And the most recent egg price increase is like $6 per dozen US, up from $5.90 US per dozen in February, and in January it was $5. So it's like ticking up pretty rapidly to buy a carton of eggs in the States, whereas marshmallows are like $1 at the dollar store. And so I just wanted to give a shout out to our intrepid American brethren who are figuring it out at a rough time by coming up with creative, crafty solutions. Who would like to go next? Erica.
Okay, so I have respect for the moderator of the English debate. Typically, looking at the strategy and how they've done debates in the past, you get a lot of different panelists. We don't need to get into any of the people that didn't get to ask questions, because I'm sure we all have different opinions about that. When it comes to a moderator, it's a really tough job. And the fact that I don't know how he votes, I think is a respectful symbol of that he was the right person for the job, and that he actually held everyone accountable with some great pushbacks and balancing who was able to speak. And I just thought he did a fabulous job. So I think he won the debate.
Yeah, that's a shout out for Steve Paikin from TVO, who is a debate old hand. He basically hosts a debate show every single week. And so, yeah, I thought he did a great job. I thought he managed to kind of corral a lot of different personalities and a lot of different styles of debate, and while also giving everybody time to speak and answer the question.
Yeah, my disrespect is to parts of the federal government handling the Africa strategy. Everyone's agreed that we need to go beyond the stereotypes, that there's massive trade potential with Africa, that we have a different legacy on the continent than the US, than Britain, than France. Everyone agrees with that, and yet right before the election, we dropped a strategy with no funding attached. It's sort of an indictment of a country that a lot of people would say is struggling to be Euro-Atlantic, Indo-Pacific, an Arctic country. I think especially when we're running the G7 this year, there is sort of a lack of rollout of what everyone has sort of agreed upon in the Foreign Service and among the parties. And I think it's just disappointing for Canadians to see that.
When it comes to, actually, I'm curious because I was in Kenya this Christmas and I was talking to people about Canada and they were like, blank, stares. They were like, who? Where? Haven't seen or heard from them. But with the shift, I guess, with America's pullback of international engagement, aside from leveling tariffs, and the drop down of support from US aid, like, is there now a role for some kind of stronger, more muscular Africa strategy?
The Harper government did a much publicized realignment of Canada's foreign aid spending and some other things from out of Africa and into the Americas. And that wasn't completely reversed by the Liberals during the last 10 years. And to be fair, Canada's footprint in either of those places is pretty minimal. But I wish there was more conversation in this election about, aside from Europe, who we are going to be partnering with in a new coalition of trade and defense and aid and all these other things as a counterweight to the United States. That's going to have to wait, I think, until after the election.
All right, Doug, your turn. What do you got for us this week?
Breaking the format, aren't I?
No, not at all.
And I am going to give some surprising respect to the right-wing nutcase columnists of the U.S. media, like David Brooks and William Crystal, who have come out recently in calling for a mass mobilization and protest movement against the Trump administration, and acknowledging to some degree that the horrors are happening because the ideas they had promoted were being taken more literally than they ever would have expected. I'm not necessarily sure about mass protests as a useful tactic, but I love the idea of those guys joining, David Frum and Brett Stevens in turning over some cars and setting them on fire on the major streets of U.S. cities. And just for that image, they deserve a certain respect.
Yeah, I love the idea of David Frum at the head of a general strike.
Yet here we are.
History is evolving and rapid, and it continues no matter what we do. Before you go, I'm going to ask you to name that number. This is when I give you a number that's in the news, and this week it's tariff related. So that number is 2,500 miles. 2,500 miles. Any guesses what that's related to?
Is that the border, the Canada-US border?
No, I don't think so.
We just don't know the imperial system, so I
was like, if it's 25,000, it's 4,000 kilometers. Times by 1.6, if that helps anyone.
Oh, that's good. That's a good number. Times by 1.6 to do the conversion. No, this is the distance from the coast of Australia where the Heard and McDonald Islands are located. If you don't know anything about the Heard and McDonald Islands it's because they were initially hit during Trump's Liberation Week with a 10% tariff. They are actually an external territory of Australia, and there is not a single human being located on that island. It is birds and penguins. It is designated a World Heritage Site in 1997 because it contains, quote, outstanding examples of biological and physical processes continuing in an environment essentially undisturbed by humans.
Well, I'm glad I add value with the conversion because I was not going to get that.
Let me take note that Vicky Mochama should never be the host of Jeopardy.
First of all, that's all I want.
Maybe the champions round, so it's like all the really impossible questions.
Yeah, that's Champions League stuff.
Thank you. I'm going to aim for that. I'm going to put that on my LinkedIn as future host of Jeopardy's Champions Week. Well, thank you so much to my guests this week, Doug Saunders, Erica Barudis, and Dylan Robertson. Does anyone want to plug anything?
Can I maybe just jump in? And I know that when we introduced, I'm the department head of the applied politics. So that people might have a question, what does that even mean? And public
what is
affairs.
applied politics?
Yeah, so I left politics after, some 20-ish years. Don't need to date myself, but to build a program of what I wish my political science degree would have taught me and what I wish someone would have taught me before I was involved in campaigns, elections, and working in politics. So it can be a program. It's a first of its kind. The most similar would be the Carleton master's program of political management, but this is a right out of high school program. If you want to get into the public affairs or political space, this will teach you everything from how does a bill get passed to how does a briefing note work, how to fundraise, and how to win a nomination contest. So it is that full 2-year diploma program offered in Alberta because that's where our campuses are. But now when we officially launch, we're in pilot phase right now because apparently I didn't make a perfect curriculum and I had to test it. But in September, we'll be launching and it'll be online nationwide.
Wonderful. Gorgeous. Dylan?
Yeah, it might
Dylan
be
wants to instruct.
I wouldn't trust myself, but I would trust the Canadian Press Promise Tracker, and not just because it takes us hours and hours to update it pretty much every day, but because it's a really good summary of what each leader has put out, the details of what they were saying, and most importantly, when in the campaign. So you can Google CP Promise Tracker. It's there. Please read it.
Yeah, I'll make sure that'll go out in our newsletter for this show. Thank you all for being here. This show is a co-production with Relay Communications and yours truly. If you can, do me a favor, leave a review or a rating on whichever app you use. I want to know what you think about the show, but I also want to know in a public setting where you have to be nice to me. I've been Vicky Mochama. I am still on Twitter/X at @BMochama. You can follow the show on Instagram at PartyAllTheTimePod and on Blue Sky at partyallthetimepod.bsky.social. We also have a newsletter called Party All the Time, where you can get the show every week. And every Tuesday, for the duration of the election, I'll be on Real Talk with Ryan Jesperson every morning, chatting about the headlines, the hurts, the dramas, the confusions, who can get it, who can't get it that week. Make sure you listen.
You've been listening to Party All the Time, hosted by Vicky Mochama. Subscribe on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.